Yeah, man, that's a pretty groovy episode there, man. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for This Side of Paradise, which is episode 26 of season 1 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Original Series, one episode at a time. And this episode I cover the episode This Side of Paradise. So This Side of Paradise is the episode where Enterprise goes to check up on the colonists who should be dead from deadly rays. However, they're alive and perfectly fine, and more than that, they seem very happy and very content and peaceful. When Kirk tells them he's ordered to evacuate them, they refuse to go, and this is mysterious. But then his crew, one by one, start acting strange and weird, and they are also helping the colonists stay. In fact, all of them want to move to the colony, and then Kirk finds out that there's these spores on the planet that protect them from these deadly rays. However, the spores had the side effect of making them very apathetic and lazy and very peaceful and content and happy, but unwilling to do anything. And so Kirk discovers that strong emotions can break the spore's powers, so he gets Spock really pissed off, and then Spock has to break it off with the girl that he was in love with, and the breakup is enough to knock her out of the entrance, as the spores calls, and then Spock and Kirk team up to have this nerve-wracking ray that makes everyone on the planet pissed off and fight each other, thus breaking the spell of the spores. And the colonists agree to be evacuated, and everyone on the Enterprise agrees to return, and they all live happily ever after at the end. So, yeah, I tried really hard not to inhale any of my incense for that intro, because I'm actually not much of a weed smoker anymore. I won't claim I never was one, but not much of one anymore. If you don't know why I made the marijuana reference, well, this episode itself is a marijuana reference. It's very obviously a PSA, hey kids, don't do drugs, made by people who have no fucking idea what drugs are, or maybe they do know, they just don't care and just want to propagate propaganda. And it's obvious watching this episode that that's the very strong message you're sending, that drugs make you, particularly marijuana, and I think it does focus on that. Although, when Spock was hanging out with his girlfriend and like lying on her lap and looking at the clouds, it's like, look, that cloud looks like a dragon. It actually seemed more like he was on LSD. So maybe, or LDS, shall I say? Voyage Home reference. Anyway, so I think they're kind of encompassing a lot of drugs, but I think the main focus was on the good old marijuana. Because of course, this is during the 60s, during the hippie movement, when marijuana was hitting the mainstream for the first time, and there was pushback from the more conservative, upright citizen types, and that was probably very commonplace on TV. I know that the show, Dragnet, which I believe Leonard Nimoy and some other cast members appeared on before, had a lot of anti-marijuana propaganda episodes as well. So it was actually common in the 60s to, fight against this damn hippie movement, which of course this show, Star Trek itself, did in a more direct way towards the hippie movement, and particular in the episode, God, what the fuck was that episode called with the damn hippies? The Way to Eden. That's right. God, and that's in my top 5 worst episodes. No, it's in my top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, because of the fact that it was critical of the hippie movement, and that also because it's a bad episode. But anyway, this episode is not quite as bad as that, but it's still naive and essentially anti-drug propaganda, and therefore I don't like it. The way it portrays, like, because before I knew, when I saw this as a teenager, I was not really, and this was before I actually partook myself, and so I wasn't like sort of hip enough to catch on to the fact that this was a marijuana PSA, so I had no idea what this episode was actually about, and I just thought it was boring and it sucked and it was stupid. It wasn't until later in life that I realized that this was just anti-drug propaganda, and that made me hate it even more than I already did. But I never liked this episode to begin with because there's not much there to this episode, and it actually surprises me. I actually had this on my top 10 episodes I hate that everyone else seems to like, because I've heard a lot of praise for this episode. It's been ranked fairly highly on IMDb, if I do recall. And it absolutely does not deserve to be. Like, just as I said, take the anti-drug thing out of it. It's still a bad episode. Because it's silly. It's a really dumb episode because first of all, let me address the gigantic plot hole. And I was paying very close attention on this rewatch to see if there was a logical explanation that they gave to this giant plot hole, but there absolutely wasn't. So Kirk and crew they have this mission to go to this colony that was colonized 3 years ago, and they're there to evacuate the colonists because there's these deadly rays that kill people. And they go there even though Kirk and crew are shocked. They're absolutely shocked that anyone is still alive. In fact, Spock is like, there's no way there's going to be survivors. So, number one, why are they being sent there to evacuate survivors if they're 100% certain there are no survivors? Now, you could argue, they're there to get the equipment and clean up the bodies and investigate and blah, 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 blah. But that's not what he fucking said at the start of the episode. Had he said that, then okay, fine, no problem. But that's not what they said. They said specifically we're there to evacuate the colonists. What colonists? You're 100% certain that they're dead. And secondly, and this is the bigger gripe, I was waiting to hear, I was listening out for the explanation that the colonists weren't aware that these deadly rays, in fact, Spock says that these deadly rays are a fairly new phenomenon. So I'm like, okay, so this explains it. The colonists were not aware of the deadly rays when they colonized the planet. Starfleet found out a couple years later and realized, oh no, these colonists are probably dead because this planet has these rays that the colonists weren't aware of. But in the episode itself, they specifically say that the colonists were aware of the risk. They knew full well of the existence of these rays and decided to colonize the planet anyway. Why? If they knew in advance that there's these deadly rays that will 100% kill you, and people are shocked beyond belief to find they're still alive, why in the fuck would they colonize the planet still? And Spock even said, it was a risk. From the way you guys are talking, it wasn't a risk. It was a certain death. So it was a certainty of death. That's not a risk. That's a suicide mission. So this makes no sense. What this whole premise is nonsense. Like, what? Yeah, so that whole intro was so sloppily written. Like, it would only take a few things, as I said, to clean it up. Say they weren't aware of the rays when they first set out, and also, and that's why they're certain for dead. Say they're there to investigate the deaths and pick up the equipment instead of evacuate the colonists. And then there you go, all the problems solved. Why is that simple to fix these problems? But anyway, Anyway. So they get there and everyone is, they actually don't seem that zoned out. It's not until like the crew starts getting infected that they really feel like they're, really stoned. The colonists themselves just seem content and happy. And the fact that, I know Kirk's like, well, what about all your animals? And his response, we're vegetarians. And Kirk's like, well, that doesn't answer my question. Why did all your animals die? I don't think it's a coincidence that they're vegetarians. A lot of hippies in the 60s were vegetarians as well. Just saying, another little sly connection there. So the analogy of, hey, kids, don't do marijuana, and it's made up very clear because when Kirk was arguing against the colonist dude who was under the influence of the spores, he's like, you're stagnant, you're not accomplishing anything, you're going nowhere. And then at the end of the episode, when the colonist guy snaps out of it, is no longer affected by the spores, he's like, we've accomplished nothing. We've done nothing. We made no progress. Now, I, on a philosophical level, disagree with that mindset, because progress, and I don't want to get into this whole argument, but progress is not necessarily a bad thing, as any environmental scientist can tell you. What we've done to the planet, all the suffering, human suffering that we've caused, if you don't want to think about other species, all the species that went extinct, all the animals that went extinct, the environments that we're completely destroying. Just think about the human suffering that we've caused through world hunger, which is not caused by lack of food. It's caused by the incorrect distribution of resources, mainly through the monetary systems and keeping countries poor, and all the human sufferings that's been caused through that, war that's been caused through fighting over resources, that was a direct population explosions that happened through this progress that caused suffering, that caused war. So the driving force of this episode, that progress is a great thing, is not something I agree with. That's a premise I think is faulty. I'll just say that. And I know there's going to be tons of people who disagree with me on this, but that's one point, and I'm just going to leave it at that. But the other point is, this is an accurate analogy to marijuana use, because sure, people who live their entire life of getting stoned every day, I don't think that's a healthy way to live. I will agree with that. But you know what? I've known some people, and I've known a lot of people who know people, and other people who know people, and there's actually some famous people. Think of all the rich, famous musicians. Do you think a single one of them, excluding country singers, because country sucks, but rock and roll, hip hop, any good music, is there any single one of them that didn't at least one point in their life not smoke marijuana? No. And is there like a vast majority, at least half of them, that smoke marijuana regularly on practically a daily basis? Fuck yeah. And they're doing just fine. They're creating this beautiful art for everyone to enjoy. But more than that, you mean like, but that's just the arts, Mark. What about practical things? You can't have surgeons sitting there getting stoned before they perform surgery. True enough. But there's many in the working class as well that I've known personally who are high functioning, who smoked marijuana like 3-4 times a day and were still high functioning, performing their job well. It's not that I'd recommend this, and not that everyone could do this, and I definitely would not recommend this. It's not a lifestyle I would ever want or try or be able to pull off myself personally. But I know some people who can and who do, and who work full-time jobs and perform their jobs well. The ones there, I'm thinking mainly of like construction workers and like house painters and stuff in that sort of kind of industry. Not like, obviously not drivers or surgeons or doctors or anything like, or lawyers or anything like that. I'm sure there might be a couple of lawyers out there, but we'll pin that. But it is possible to contribute to progress and still do drugs. And especially as far as drugs like marijuana, which is incorrectly classified as a powerful drug when in actuality, scientific fact, it is less powerful, less harmful than alcohol, which has been legal for centuries because it's so integrated in the culture. So it's more of a cultural thing than the actual chemical makeup or effect on the drugs. So that's another point, that comparing marijuana to heroin or cocaine or meth is kind of like comparing a banana to a machine gun. I remember that's a comedian who said that once. I'm not taking credit for that, but that's true. It is true. So, and that's another point. So. And plus, coffee is a drug, and it's endorsed by society. It's society prefers you take that drug, and it's definitely a drug. I've had really bad side effects from coffee. I've had massive headaches if I stop drinking caffeine. If I don't have caffeine for a day, I get these massive migraines, and of course I'm not the only one. That's very common because I'm addicted and I'm going through withdrawals. It's a fucking drug. Yet society says that drug. Okay, now I'm going off on a tangent about drugs. I'm sorry, that was not my point. My point is that this episode is dumb. It's completely inaccurate, and it's just bullshit propaganda that doesn't understand anything about how drugs actually work. That's my point. So, it's hard for me to take this episode seriously or to like it in the slightest bit because of that. But let's leave aside the drug analogy for now. And let's get back to when I saw this episode when I was 11. I had no idea that this was about drugs. I knew nothing about drugs. It's boring. It's silly that these plants and the music, the way that when the plants, the spores, shoot someone, they play this really annoying, loud saxophone or trumpet that goes, da, da, da! And it's so annoying, and it's and then it makes them go oh, I'm gonna have a mint tulip, and everyone's sort of acting all silly and dumb. It's just that's a stupid plot. I don't think that's interesting at all. One of the Patreon comments I'm going to read at the end of the of this video is going referred to, compared this episode to Return of the Archons. I actually think Return of the Archons is better because that was more of a direct analogy on the dangers of religious cults, and that actually was a good analogy, unlike this one. But more to the point, they pulled off the whole, there's this threat of these people that claim to make you peaceful, but they actually didn't. We're here, just let these fuckers, if they want to stay on the planet and live with these spores, then let them do that. But of course, we find out at the end of the episode, because we have to prove that marijuana is bad, that they actually didn't want that, and the spores were just manipulating them. Fine, then okay, let's help them to overcome the spores so they can actually do what they actually want to do with free through outside influence, but still not an accurate analogy to marijuana in the slightest bit. Again, leaving behind the drug analogy, the fact that everyone in the crew is like, I'm just gonna go on the planet and fuck you, Captain. You can stay here and we're gonna live peace. It's hard to buy. It's hard to buy that these spores would affect them so strongly, and it's hard to really care. And I gotta talk about one of the funniest scenes, and I mentioned this before when I talked about this episode before in other videos, how when Kirk is like on the bridge after everyone beamed down, he's recording Captain's log, and he's like, I'm lost, I'm abandoned, and the ship's only gonna last for another month after, and I'm gonna have to abandon it, and I'm marooned here, oh, woe is me. And then all of a sudden, this like plant just comes into the screen out of nowhere and goes boom. It's just, was the plant like following him around and waiting for like right moment to go boom, spray and sprays him. And of course they play that annoying music. I laughed my ass off when I first saw this. This is some of the dumbest shit the original series has ever done. But yeah, so to be fair, when I watched this episode, I was paying attention. There was a scene earlier where he was talking to Uhura, and she's like, I disabled the communications, sir, so screw you, I'm going to the plant. Where there was a plant with the spores on it, like near where she was, and Kirk like just tossed it aside. And to be fair, he did toss it in the exact spot where it did pop up and shoot him in the face, but it was like limp and like inactive when he tossed it, so it kind of grew and was just like sitting there. And did he not notice it, or did it like spookily sneak attack him and go? If he didn't notice it, then he's a moron, which I don't buy. So we're meant to believe it like it snuck up on him and did a sneak attack and went like, boom! It's just so dumb. It's anyway. Oh God. And then okay, so let me get to the only thing that saves this episode from being a 1 from me, for being one of the worst episodes of the entire show. And that is the storyline with Spock falling in love with this woman, and then after Spock is broken, his spell is broken from the spores, he has to confront her and tell her that he's not going to be with her anymore, and he's going back to the Enterprise. That was actually a very effective scene. I give all the credit to DC Fontana, who is a great writer, and particularly a great writer of Spock, and this is one of her better sort of Spock scenes that really explored and fleshed out this character more. And I do suspect that's actually why a lot of people do like this episode, even though this episode is no good. Because that is the one good thing about this episode. That scene was actually a really good scene where Spock had to break up with her, and you could see through, even though he knew he had to maintain his Vulcan control over his emotions and resume his life on the Enterprise, you could see he was still emotionally affected. And this is also credit to Leonard Nimoy, of course, who's an amazing actor. I've never been shy of saying that. Was an amazing actor. So sad to say that. But anyway, this is to his credit to this performance. This is a really, really good performance where he's able to show the fact, even through his stoic volcanism and the fact that he's choosing this life of emotionless, stoic volcanism, that you can see that he is actually, even though he's trying to hide it, he is saddened by this. And he is moved by the reaction of Layla and how devastated she is, and that he doesn't want to cause her this much pain. It's just the situation they're in. And so that's actually a very powerful scene. So this is the only thing that saves this episode for me from being a 1, because I would very easily make this episode a 1 and say it's one in the top 5 worst of the entire show, if not for this scene, which is actually an excellent scene, well written, well acted. So that's the one episode saving grace, in my humble But it certainly doesn't make it a good episode, and I will still take issue with anyone who thinks this is one of the better episodes of the series because of that one scene, because the rest of the episode's garbage. Anyway, so now let me take the time to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel. Thank you so much for your support. Very much appreciated. Very much keeps this channel going, keeps it strong, and absolutely thank you so much for your support. So, we have my trusted Patreon supporters: Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Matty Jester, Joel Avals, Brian A., Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so much for your support in the channel. Very much appreciated. So now let me get into a couple of patron comments that Patreon supporters have left. First comment is from Ricky that says, "When I first watched this episode, I thought for sure that this was considered one of the worst episodes of TOS, but then for some reason a lot of people love this episode and put it in their top 10 best episodes. The whole premise about the plants getting people high is dumb. That they get to the point that the entire Enterprise gets spores and want to stay on the planet. The most ridiculous scene of the episode is when Kirk is by himself and all of a sudden that plant pops out of nowhere and blasts Kirk with spores. I was laughing hysterically when I saw that. This would be in my top 5 worst TOS episodes, but the scene where Spock broke up with the girl that was in love with him was actually a really strong and even a bit emotional scene that got to me. So it saves it from a 1. But besides that, it's still a terrible episode, so my rating is a 3 out of 10. Wow. Me and Ricky are very much on the same page. He pretty much said a lot of the stuff I had already said. So yeah, we're in pretty strong agreement over this episode. It's great to see someone else who also agrees with me on this episode. Yeah, that one scene does kind of save it from being a 1, just like I said. Anyway, the other comment I have is from Matty Jester. So, Matty Jester's comment: "This episode I think is fine. It reminds me a bit of the Archons episode with people being taken over and being happy. I suppose that was a trope of the era, referencing drugs maybe. I laughed at the scene where the plant pops out on the bridge and is like, 'Surprise! Kirk face!' and blasts him. Funny stuff. The scene with Spock at the end are sad and memorable, but I don't feel like there's quite enough in this episode as a whole to put it on a very high tier for me. A solid 6 out of 10. Well, I personally think that's maybe a little too generous to this episode, but again, Maddie made a lot of the same points I did about the... everyone points out that plant. That was just so dumb. And to be clear, it's funny in a way that's because it's so terrible, because it's funny because it's bad. Anyway, my rating for this side of Paradise out of 10 is going to be a 3. Very poor, which is, so as I said, I'm in complete agreement with Ricky, who also gave this a 3. As I said, this episode would be a 1 if not for that one scene with Spock. That scene with Spock and Layla and the breakup was an excellent scene, but one scene can only elevate an entire episode 2 points. It can't make it a 5. Can't make it a 6. Just having one good scene, but the rest of the episode be total propaganda garbage that's nonsense, can only get you up another 2 points. So it gets it up to a 3. Very poor rather than a 1. So it does save it from being a 1. But if you take this scene out, this is easily a 1. This is easily a terrible, 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 terrible episode with nothing except that one scene to save it. So that is it for my review of this side of Paradise. So be sure to check out my channel as I do those aforementioned videos and covering many other shows. Of course, continuing my coverage of the original series. In February, we'll start covering Picard Season 3 when that comes out. And of course, I cover many other shows and films on my channel, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.